Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Accessibility Online webinar series, a collaborative program of the U.S. Access Board and the ADA National Network, hosted by the Great Lakes ADA Center. Before our session begins at the bottom of the hour, I'm going to take a few minutes to be able to review the webinar platform today and how we're going to be able to use it before we start our program. This webinar sign-in process is important if you are somebody who's looking to get credit for today's session. If you already have or had a Zoom profile before you signed in today, make sure that you know what your name appears. It may not be appropriate for many people. We see, I was perusing a little bit a while ago, I see people who are in with only their first initial or an acronym or their company's name, etc. Also people who says I'm on my, Becky's iPhone or whatever, that we will not be able to give you credit for today's session unless we're able to match you up in the participant list with our registration list. So if you're not familiar with how your Zoom profile appears, please send us a message in the chat area so we can verify for you and give you instructions and help you change that for today's session to get credit. Zoom has made some changes, and they, depending on the version of Zoom you are using currently, you may have been asked to enter your email address and your name when you signed in. It's only available in the most recent version of Zoom. Make sure that you use the same email that you have used in your registration with accessibilityonline.org, because again, that's how we match you up for your registration and attendance today. So just a note that a failure to do these things and to verify could result in you voiding any continuing education recognition, because we have to be able to document and verify your attendance. Again, you can send us a message in chat to verify if you're not familiar or clear with how you appear in Zoom. For the Zoom interface today, we'll be using the whiteboard for our PowerPoint presentation as you are viewing it today right now. If you're using a PC or an Apple device, except not a mobile or a tablet, your controls for audio will be in your lower left-hand corner. We'll talk about those in a minute. The chat icon will be used, and we'll talk about that as well for instructions, etc. The Q&A icon will be used to submit questions to speakers. The CC icon is where you can turn on or off the live captioning. You also can access the transcript in order to, if you're interested in getting a transcript. The leave button in the lower right-hand corner is for exiting the session. If you have to exit for any reason and come back in, you will be able to do so. At the upper right-hand corner is the screen option that you can change your view. It only changes the view for you. It does not change the view for others. If you're listening with it on your computer today, please note or make note of the fact that Zoom can take over your sound control. So even though you feel like you may have adjusted your own sound on your computer, Zoom will overtake that and has its own controls. So if you're having any problems with sound today, please make sure that you check it through the Zoom audio controls, which can be accessed under the audio control area by just opening that box and checking your speaker settings. If you're listening via the telephone today, telephone numbers were provided in the email as well as they're on the website. So again, if you are only on the phone today, please note that you will not be able to submit questions because the phone doesn't offer you that option, but you can send an email and we'll provide you those instructions in a few minutes. Real-time captioning is being provided today, human generated. It's both in Zoom as well as stream text. Links have been posted in the chat area for the stream text if you would like to access that. If you are using stream text, you can open a separate browser and resize your screen so they can view both the presentation and the browser at the same time, and the captions at the same time. If you're using Zoom's captioning, you can mouse over and move your captioning box anywhere on the screen that you desire it to be. There also are options within Zoom to enlarge the font or adjust the display area size within the subtitles settings options in the Zoom or the CC icon. You can also choose to view the full transcript within Zoom by mousing over the CC icon and selecting View Full Transcript option. We're also offering video sign language interpreter today via Video Spotlight. There are 2 sign language interpreters. They will be swapping their images as we switch interpreters during the session. This may cause a brief pause or brief interruption in the sign language. Individuals can change your view of sign language interpreter on your desktop, laptop, computer by choosing the swap video and shared screen options in your viewing options menu. Tablet and phone options for viewing the video will differ depending on the device that you are using. Please note we are also broadcasting today via YouTube live stream so that individuals who are unable to register because we filled up so quickly today for this session will be viewing via that option, and their sign language and such will be controlled totally through the YouTube streaming process. They will not have individual control over these things. Again, if you need to change your view, you can just use that view option to swap video and shared screen. So the sign language interpreter can swap so you can see both the screen and the interpreter. If you would like to hide the video, you can click on the underline symbol found in the upper left-hand corner of the video, and that will hide the video for you. If you need to enlarge the image of the sign language interpreter, just mouse over the edge of the video box. And once you get the double arrow, use it to stretch the image to your desired size. It, again, only changes your view, not the view of others. As I noted earlier, we'll be using the Q&A icon for questions today. No questions that you put in the chat area will be responded by the presenters, so please make sure that you enter anything that you want the presenters to see in the Q&A area. If you are listening on the phone and you are not connected to the webinar platform, you can email your questions to us at webinars@adaconferences.org, and we will convey that question to our speakers today. Please note we will be recording today's webinar. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please send us a message in the chat area and we'll assist you in any way we possibly can. Or you can email us at webinars@adaconferences.org. At this time, we will stop sharing this and I will invite our presenters to please share their presentations so that we can begin today's session.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. My name is Josh Shore. I am the training coordinator here at the U.S. Access Board. And welcome to our monthly series on the built environment. This month, we are going to be talking about designing accessible crosswalks and taking from the newly released PROAG guidelines and telling you guys all about how to make those accessible. Next slide. So you're going to have a few presenters today. You've got Sarah Presley, Travis Sainer, and Juliet Schultz. They all have great knowledge on PROAG and will be able to help guide you through today. And I am just going to toss it right on over to Sarah. Sarah, you are muted if you are talking.
It's actually Travis.
Oh, it was Travis first. Sorry.
Okay. Thanks everybody for watching. As Josh said, in this webinar, we're going to be going over things to do with crosswalks. Next slide, please. We'll be going over the PROAG purpose, crosswalk definition, pavement markings, pedestrian access routes, curb ramp and blended transitions, detectable warning surfaces, accessible pedestrian signals, and then time willing, we'll be able to field some questions. So let's get into this with our next slide, please. Slide 4. Okay, so I wanted to touch on the purpose of PROAG. Now, the Americans with Disability Act was signed into law in July of 1990. The ADA is a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities and is enforceable by the Department of Justice. The ADA is present in many aspects of public life, including jobs, schools, transportation, and many public and private places that are open to the general public. The guidelines help you know how to make the ADA standards possible. So since then, since 1990, the state and local government facilities Public accommodations and commercial facilities are required to be readily accessible to and usable by individuals with disabilities. The DOJ and DOT have placed the burden on the state governments of making sure the local governments are following the ADA standards through Title II of the ADA. That requires the state and local governments to give people with disabilities an equal opportunity to benefit from all of their programs, services, and activities. Now, PROAG R203.3 requires that pedestrian access routes be provided within pedestrian circulation paths, no matter where they may be. So a sidewalk in the right of way of a public street that is meant for public pedestrian circulation is more than likely within the jurisdiction of that state or local government. States, counties, municipalities, cities, towns, villages, and all the rest of the Title II entities should be following the ADA standards already. Once PROAG has been adopted by the Department of Justice or the Department of Transportation, all Title II entities will be obligated to comply with the PROAG. At that point, PROAG will be enforceable by the DOJ. This is why a lot of states and local governments have already incorporated PROAG into their transition plans, which, by the way, is also a requirement under Title II of the ADA. As a primary guidance for accessible facility design on their projects. This includes public right-of-way that forms boundary of a site or that lies within a site bounded by a property line, where a public right-of-way is part of a site covered by the ADA or Title II of the ADA. These guidelines apply to the public right-of-way portion of that site. So when I say public right-of-way, that's public land acquired for or dedicated to transportation purposes, or other land where there is a legal established right for use by the public for transportation purposes, regardless of what that purpose may be, such as a pedestrian circulation path. Next slide, please, slide 5. All right, so what are crosswalks? And let's find out on our next slide, please, slide 6. In the proposed rule, we've referred to them as pedestrian street crossings. For consistency with the MUTCD, we no longer call them pedestrian street crossings. In the final rule, we now call them crosswalks. So a crosswalk is present wherever there is a pedestrian circulation path at an intersection on one side of the street that approaches the roadway at an angle such that the path would cross the street if the lateral lines of the path were continued, regardless of whether it's a marked or unmarked crosswalk, or where pavement markings indicate a crosswalk. The definition of an intersection was eliminated from the defined terms because the board thought that the state and local DOTs could identify an intersection. So just for informational purposes, the short version of the AASHTO Green Book defines an intersection as a general area where two or more highways join or cross. Next slide, please, slide 7. At those crosswalks, there may be some pavement markings. Now, the PROAG does not require crosswalks to be marked. If they are marked, they may look something like what you can find in the MUTCD in figure 3C-1. But again, the PROAG does not require crosswalks to be marked. Next slide, please. And now we're moving on to pedestrian access routes. Next slide, please. Okay, so as most of you already know, in R302.2, the continuous clear width of a pedestrian access route, exclusive of the width of any curb, is 48 inches minimum. Now, PROAG does not have a requirement for crosswalk widths. However, PROAG does have a requirement for a minimum clear width within that crosswalk, that being the 48-inch minimum. So within medians and pedestrian refuge islands, the clear width of a pedestrian access route is 60 inches minimum, with the exception of where shared path use paths cross any medians and pedestrian refuge islands. There, the clear width of the pedestrian access route will be 60 inches minimum, or at least as wide as the crosswalk, whichever is greater of the two. And this should, and just for informational purposes, the pedestrian access route on a shared use path must extend the full width of the pedestrian circulation path. So the full width of that shared use path is now required to be. All right, next slide, please, slide 10. Okay, the grade of pedestrian access route within the highway right of way has not changed from the proposed rule, and that's 120 or 5.0%, with the exception of where the grade of the adjacent street exceeds 5%. The grade of the pedestrian access route is permitted to match the grade of the adjacent street. So say you have a street that runs down a hill with an 8% grade. The pedestrian access route running parallel to that street within the right of way is allowed to have up to an 8% grade to match that grade of that street. Right, so the grade of the pedestrian access route within a crosswalk, the minimum grade will be 1 in 20 or 5%, with the exception of where a roadway design requires super elevation greater than 5.0% at the location of a crosswalk. The grade of the pedestrian access route within that crosswalk may be the same grade as the super elevation. So super elevation is the banking of the roadway where the outside edge of pavement is higher than the inside edge. This allows a vehicle to go through a curve safer and at a higher speed than than what would be possible without the super elevation that counterbalances the centrifugal force or outward pull of the vehicle when it goes around the corner. Next slide, please. Slide 11. All right, cross slopes. Being the slopes perpendicular to the direction of pedestrian travel. Now, cross slopes of pedestrian access route contained within a crosswalk depends on the location of the crosswalk. So at a crosswalk with a yield or stop control device, the minimum allowed cross slope is 2.1%. At an uncontrolled approach, the maximum allowed cross slope is 5%. At a crosswalk with traffic control signals or pedestrian hybrid beacons, the cross slope can be up to 5% also. And for the crosswalk located at mid-block or roundabouts, the cross slope should be no greater than the grade of the road. So I also wanted to mention in the proposed rule, slope measurements were stated only in percentages, which in most cases had been rounded to the whole numbers. So for consistency with the ADAG in the final rule, slopes are expressed in both ratios and percentages. The board has elected to state percentages to one decimal place for the ease of implementation, as current digital measuring tools commonly used in sidewalk construction typically provide measurements to 1 decimal place. So a cross slope specified as 1 in 48 or 2.1 maximum is considered a range from 0 to the 1 in 48 or 2.1%. So designing to a dimension below the maximum, say of 1.5%, allows for construction inaccuracies without the need for a tolerance. All right, so say at that street where you had the hill with 8% grade, if there were a mid-block crosswalk in there, The slope of the clear space would need to exceed 1 in 48 or 2.1% in either or both directions. Due to the grade of the adjacent pedestrian access route conforming to the requirements of the slope, the clear space may be consistent with the slope of the pedestrian access route. With a mid-block crossing that is at an 8% grade. So it can have a adjacent curb ramp cross slope up to 8% also. So next slide, slide 12, please. Okay, surfaces are 302.6. So sidewalks, shared use paths, and other pedestrian circulation paths must contain a pedestrian access route, which is required to be accessible to and traversable by individuals with disabilities. The walking surfaces of these pedestrian access routes, elements, and spaces are required to be accessible and must be stable, firm, and slip resistant. Now, stable surfaces resist movement, while firm surfaces resist deformity by applied forces. Accessible surfaces remain unchanged by external forces, objects, or materials. Next slide, slide 13, please. All right, grade breaks and changes in level. So grade breaks must be flush. In R 302.7.2 vertical surfaces, discontinuity of the proposed rule has been replaced with R 302.6.2 changes in level. In the final rule, which is consistent with the ADA and ABA accessibility guidelines. So changes in level are permitted to be up to a quarter inch without treatment, or 1/2 inch if beveled with a slope no steeper than 1 in 2. Next slide, please, slide 14. Horizontal openings in ground surfaces should not allow passage of a sphere larger than 1/2 inch in diameter. Elongated openings should be placed so that the long dimension is perpendicular to the dominant direction of travel, as in the image on the slide. Where multiple directions of travel intersect, elongated openings should be placed perpendicular to the dominant direction of travel. Now, it is not recommended, but it is acceptable to have utilities within the pedestrian circulation path. On new construction, it would be best to design them out of the pedestrian circulation path areas, and in alterations, if at all possible, again, design them out of the pedestrian circulation path. Understandably, this is not always possible, as long as the continuous clear width is free of any type of protruding objects, horizontal openings larger than 1/2 inch in diameter, grade breaks and changes in level of 1/4 inch without treatment, or 1/2 inch without bevel, with slopes no steeper than 1 in 20, or if all that's followed. Things such as manhole covers, pull box lids, or anything like that that's placed in the pedestrian access route will require continual maintenance to make sure they're kept in compliance with these requirements. The lids and everything else within the pedestrian circulation path must also be stable, firm, and slip resistant. Again, maintenance would be a key in making sure that they stayed in compliance. Next slide, please, slide 15. Curb ramps and blended transitions. Next slide, please, 16. Now in R 304.2.4, a 48-inch by 48-inch clear area is required beyond the bottom grade break of a perpendicular ramp. If the perpendicular ramp is at a shared use path, the clear area must be as wide as the shared use path. The clear area must be located within the width of the crosswalk and outside of the vehicle lanes, vehicle travel lanes. This is including any bike lanes that run parallel to the crosswalk. The maximum allowed running slope for the clear area is 5%, and the clear area cross slope is in 302 R302.5 because the clear area is essentially part of the crosswalk there. Next slide, please, slide 17. In R304.3.4, at the bottom of a parallel curb ramp, landings must be 48-inch minimum by 48-inch minimum. The slope of the landing measured parallel to the direction of travel on the curb ramp run is permitted to be equal to or less than the slope of the roadway or the cross slope of the crosswalk as specified by R302.5. The cross slope of the landing cannot exceed 148, 2.1%, measured perpendicular to the direction of travel on the curb ramp run. Next slide, please, slide 18. Perpendicular curb ramps, curb ramp runs, parallel curb ramp landings, and 48-inch minimum width of blended transitions must be fully contained within the width of the crosswalks they serve, with the exception of at shared use paths, the full width of the perpendicular curb ramp runs, parallel curb ramp landings, or the blended transitions must be fully contained within the width of the crosswalk it serves. Next slide, please, slide 19. Change of grade is another common requirement. At gutters and streets where a change of grade occurs adjacent to the curb ramps and blended transitions, the change of grade must comply with either option A, which is sum of the grade of the crosswalk and the grade of the adjacent curb ramp, or blended transition cannot exceed 13.3%. Next slide, please, slide 20. Or option B, if the sum of the grade of the crosswalk and the grade of the adjacent curb ramp or blended transition exceeds 13.3%, a transitional space of at least 2 foot in the direction of pedestrian travel and for the full width of the curb ramp run or blended transition must be provided at the bottom of the running slope of the curb ramp run or blended transition. Next slide, please, slide 21. All right, crosswalks at intersections. We require 1 curb ramp or blended transition to be provided for each crosswalk. That means in your typical 4-way intersection with 4 crosswalks, you will have 8 curb ramps, 1 curb ramp serving each end of the corresponding crosswalk, with the exception in alterations where existing physical constraints make compliance with R203.6.1.1 technically infeasible, a single curb ramp complying with R304 shall be permitted at the apex of the intersection corner. There you could use a blended transition that still serves both crosswalks. Next slide, please, slide 22. Mid-block and roundabouts are the same. Crosswalk curb ramps or blended transitions shall be provided on both ends of the crosswalk. Next slide, please, slide 23. All right, so where jurisdictions that don't want to provide a crosswalk, or it has been determined necessary that a crosswalk should be closed for various safety factors, or just the reason they may be, and the pedestrian crossing is going to be prohibited, you must prohibit crossing at that crosswalk for all pedestrians. Where crosswalks are at intersections where pedestrian crossing is prohibited, curb ramps or blended transitions should not be provided. And the pedestrian circulation paths must be either A, separated from the roadway with a landscape or other non-prepared surface, or B, separated from the roadway by a detectable vertical edge treatment with a bottom edge 15 inches maximum above the pedestrian circulation path. Next slide, please, slide 24. So edge detection at roundabouts. The edge detection helps guide pedestrians who are blind or have low vision to the crosswalk. Edge detection is required on the street side edge of the pedestrian circulation path at the approach and along the circulatory roadway of the roundabout, where crossing is not intended. So this edge detection is to prevent all pedestrians from crossing into the circulatory roadway. This edge detection goes from crosswalk to crosswalk. Edge detection can be provided in two ways. The first way is by separation, where pedestrian circulation path is not attached to the curb, landscaping, or other non-prepared surfaces 24 inches wide minimum, as shown on the top image of the slide. And then the second way is by a vertical edge treatment. So a roundabout curb attached pedestrian circulation path has to be continuous and detectable. At the bottom edge must be no more than 15 inches above the pedestrian circulation path, making it cane detectable. You only need one or the other. You do not need both. As in the image on the top here, it has the grassy area at the back of curb to the sidewalk, and it also has the fence there, the handrail. Only one of those is required. Detectable warning surfaces cannot be used for roundabout edge detection. Next slide, please, slide 25. Okay, R305, detectable warnings have a distinctive surface pattern of domes detectable by cane or underfoot that alert people with vision impairments of their approach to a street crossing or a hazardous drop-off. They're used to indicate the boundary between pedestrian and vehicular routes, where there's a flush instead of a curbed connection. Detectable warnings also indicate unprotected drop-offs along the edges of boarding platforms at transit stations and stops. Next slide, please, slide 26. Detectable warning surfaces are required on curb ramps, blended transitions, with the exception of when the curb ramps and blended transitions are used exclusively to connect passenger loading zones, accessible parallel on-street parking spaces, and access aisles for perpendicular and angled parking spaces. Detectable warning surfaces are also required on pedestrian refuge islands greater than 6 feet, driveways with stop or yield signage, rail platform edges where the edge is not protected by a guard or barrier, rail crossings. The DOT standards require them on curb ramps in transit facilities as well. So since this is a webinar at Crosswalks, I will just be going over the curb ramps, blended transitions, and pedestrian refuge islands. Let's see, but first let's look at the size and installation of them. Next slide, please, 27. So visual contrast and surface size. Detectable warning surfaces must contrast visually with adjacent walking surfaces. That means either light on dark or dark on light. This does not mean red clay tinted concrete and a rust colored detectable warning surface, as most steel detectable warning surfaces tend to rust and have the rust patina color after a little time in the elements. This is not visually contrasting. And they must extend at least 2 feet in the direction of pedestrian travel. Next slide, please, slide 28. Okay, so the width of detectable warning surfaces really depends on where they are placed. At curb ramps and blended transitions, they will be placed the full width of the curb run, blended transition, or landing, excluding any flared sides. As for cut through pedestrian refuge islands, they will be placed the full width of the pedestrian circulation path opening, however wide that may be. Next slide, please, slide 29. So where a concrete barrier is required for proper installation of a detectable warning surface, a concrete border not exceeding 2 inches is permitted on all sides of the detectable warning surface, with the exception of the area between the detectable warning surface and the edge of pavement where a setback is already permitted. This language was previously in the advisory, and it has now become incorporated into the subprovision of R305.2. Also, detectable warning surfaces are not intended to provide directional information. The rows of truncated domes and detectable warning surfaces should be aligned perpendicular to the grade break between the ramp run and the street. This is so pedestrians who use wheelchairs can track between the domes, where detectable warning surfaces are provided on a surface with a slope that is less than 5%. Dome orientation is less critical. Again, detectable warning surfaces are not intended to provide directional information. Next slide, please, slide 30. This is particularly for perpendicular curb ramps where a setback is permitted based on the location of the grade break. On perpendicular curb ramps where the end of the bottom grade break are in front of the back of curb or at the edge of pavement where there is no curb, the detectable warnings surface must be placed at the back of curb no greater than 6 inches from the edge of pavement where there is no curb. So when we're talking about the 2-inch border required for the proper installation of the detectable warning surfaces, remember the 2 inches is already included in this. So it's not 6 inches plus 2 more inches, it's 6 inches, no more. Next slide, please, slide 31. On perpendicular curb ramps where the end of the bottom grade break are behind the back of curb or edge of pavement where there is no curb, and the distance from both ends of the bottom grade break to the back of curb or edge of pavement where there is no curb is 60 inches or less. The detectable warning surfaces shall be placed on the ramp run at the bottom grade break. Next slide, please, slide 32. On perpendicular curb ramps where the end of the bottom grade break are behind the back of curb or edge of pavement where there is no curb, and the distance from either end of the bottom grade break to the back of curb or edge of pavement where there is no curb is more than 60 inches, the detectable warning surface shall be placed on the clear area so that both front corners of the detectable warning surface are at the back of curb or no greater than 6 inches from the edge of the pavement where there is no curb. Next slide, please, slide 33. On parallel curb ramps, detectable warning surfaces must be located on the landing at either back of curb or the edge of pavement where there is no curb. Next slide, please. On blended transitions, DWSs must be located on the blended transition so that both front corners of the detectable warning surfaces are at the back of curb or no greater than 6 inches from the edge of pavement where there is no curb. And next slide, please, slide 35. Pedestrian refuge island is defined in the final rule as an area 72 inches long minimum in the direction of pedestrian travel located between traffic lanes for pedestrian refuge within a median, splitter island or a channelized island. So not every refuge island is going to meet the definition of a pedestrian refuge island as defined in PROAG. And so not all refuge islands are going to be required to have detectable warning surfaces. So the ones that do meet the definition of a cut-through pedestrian refuge island, detectable warning surfaces must be located no greater than 6 inches from the edge of the pedestrian refuge island or at back of curb and must be separated by a 24-inch minimum length of surface in the direction of travel without detectable warning surfaces. Again, the detectable warning surfaces and the edge of pavement where a setback is already permitted, the 2 inches is included in that setback already. Next slide, please, slide 36. So curb extensions, bulb outs are not required by the PROAG. I just wanted to highlight a few things about them. They may increase pedestrian visibility. Curb extensions could help improve sight lines for drivers so that pedestrians wanting to cross the intersection are seen easier. Standard intersections with no curb extensions can place foot traffic further away from vehicular traffic, which in some cases may make it difficult for drivers to spot pedestrians. It may also make it easier for pedestrians to see oncoming traffic when crossing the intersection. It may reduce crossing distances. Shorter crossing distances could improve foot traffic safety and overall walkability. Traffic calming. They could slow traffic speeds, and curb extensions could shorten the turning radius in intersections, reducing vehicle turning speeds. They could increase space for streetscaping. The additional space created by curb extensions could allow for placement of light poles, benches, trash receptacles, and other amenities that could help enhance the city's streetscape. Parking. Curb extensions could make illegal parking at bus stops and crosswalks much harder to do. But again, just some food for thought, but curb extensions, bulb outs are not required in PROAG. And with that, I will turn it over to Sarah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Travis. And we should be on slide 37 now. So now that we have talked about requirements for the physical design of crosswalks, let's talk about requirements that can help people who are blind or low vision get the information that they need to cross the street efficiently and safely. And mostly these are going to be provided in the requirements for accessible pedestrian signals. So for what I'm going to be covering, the scoping requirements are in section R206, and the technical requirements are in sections R306.2, R306.3, R307, and R308. Next slide, slide 38. So before we get into talking about this, I just wanted to briefly go over a couple of definitions for some intervals that we're going to be talking about as we go through the requirements for these signals. So first, we have the walk interval, which is an interval during which the walking person symbolizing walk is displayed. If you have one of those, signals where you have walk and don't walk, that the walk interval is when that walking person is displayed. And the pedestrian change interval is an interval during which the flashing upraised hand symbolizing don't walk is displayed for one of those signals. And finally, we have the pedestrian clearance time, which is the time that it takes a pedestrian to walk from the location of the pedestrian push button for one of these signals to a pedestrian refuge island or to the far side of the traveled way. And we'll be hearing more about all of these as we go through these requirements. Next slide, slide 39. So first, we're going to talk about pedestrian signal phase timing. We have some requirements for how this timing has to be calculated. So where a traffic control signal with pedestrian signal indications is provided at a crosswalk, pedestrian signal phase timing must be based on a pedestrian clearance time that is calculated using a pedestrian walking speed of 3.5 feet per second or less, and that's from the location of the pedestrian push button to a pedestrian refuge island or to the far side of the traveled way, which of course is what that definition for the pedestrian clearance time. There is an exception for the walking speed. So if a passive pedestrian detection device is used to automatically adjust the pedestrian clearance time based on the pedestrian's actual clearance of the crosswalk, then a faster walking speed may be used. Now, for these calculations, the walk interval must be 7 seconds minimum. And if the pedestrian clearance time is calculated to a pedestrian refuge island, then an additional pedestrian push button or passive detection device must be provided on that pedestrian refuge island. And then, of course, you're going to have to calculate another pedestrian clearance time from the pedestrian refuge island to the far edge of the traveled way. Next slide, slide 40. So now we can move on to the accessible pedestrian signals, and we will start with the definition. So these are devices that communicate information about pedestrian signal timing in non-visual formats, such as audible or speech, audible tones or speech messages, and also by way of vibrating surfaces. Next slide, slide 41. So when we're talking about accessible pedestrian signals, in PROAG at least, there are two types of devices that have requirements. And these are traffic control devices with pedestrian signal heads, and the other one is pedestrian activated warning devices. So we will start with the definition and requirements for the traffic control devices with pedestrian signal heads. So a pedestrian signal head is the device containing the walking person symbol, which symbolizes walk, and the upraised hand symbol symbolizing don't walk, that is installed to direct pedestrian traffic at a crosswalk. Now, another relevant definition here is a definition for a pedestrian hybrid beacon, which is a special type of hybrid beacon used to warn and control traffic at an unsignalized location to assist pedestrians in crossing a street at a marked crosswalk. And basically what this hybrid beacon does is if somebody pushes its button, it turns an unsignalized intersection into a signalized intersection. Normally it's not signalized, but if you press the button, then you get those signals. So that's the pedestrian hybrid beacon. Next slide, slide 42. So now on to the requirements for the pedestrian signal heads. So where traffic control signals or hybrid beacons with pedestrian signal heads are provided at a crosswalk, accessible pedestrian signals are required. And the requirements for these are that there has to be a pedestrian push button or passive detection to activate the accessible features of the signal, and where applicable, the walk interval. And the main accessible feature for these accessible pedestrian signals for pedestrian signal heads is the audible and vibrotactile walk indication, which we will talk about more. Next slide, slide 43. And onto the pedestrian activated warning devices. So these are devices that are installed in conjunction with a warning sign, and these are activated to alert vehicle operators to the presence of a pedestrian. And an example of a pedestrian activated warning device is a rectangular rapid flashing beacon. Next slide, slide 44. So there are more limited requirements for these pedestrian activated warning devices because the information that they provide for pedestrians is in fact more limited. So where a pedestrian activated warning device is provided, accessible pedestrian signals are required that have, again, they have to have that push button or passive detection to activate their accessible features. And for this pedestrian activated warning device, the main accessible feature is a speech message that indicates the status of the beacon. And this is in lieu of an audible and vibrotactile walk indication because these types of devices do not in fact have a walk indication. They just have, you know, yellow flashing or red to indicate to drivers what's going on. And so what's required here is an audible message to tell somebody what the status of that beacon is. And there is no vibrotactile component for these because we don't want to confuse people and make them think, well, if they're just feeling the vibration and they think, oh, that means I can walk. We don't want that because there is no walk indication for these types of devices. Next slide, slide 45. So unless passive detection is provided, pedestrian push buttons are required for both the traffic control signals with pedestrian signal heads and for the pedestrian activated warning devices. So these push buttons must comply with the requirements for operable parts, meaning of course they've got to be, and we do have requirements for operable parts in ProAg. And of course that includes having them within an accessible reach range and making sure that it doesn't take more than 5 pounds of force to activate the button. And you got to have a clear space to get to it. Now, with these push button, an extended button press may be used to provide optional features beyond what is required. And some of the examples of optional features could be audible beaconing, which is using locator tones of these signals to help guide people who are blind across the street. And another feature could be additional crossing time. And there could be other types of informational features that could be provided. So if this extended push button press is used to provide these additional features, then a button press of less than 1 second must activate the pedestrian timing and any associated accessible walk indication or status indication in the case of pedestrian activated warning devices. Now, if a button press of greater or equal to 1 second would actuate the pedestrian timing and any associated accessible walk indication or status indication, and then any of those additional features that are provided. Now, if the extended push button press provides additional crossing time, then a sign indicating that must be mounted adjacent to or integral with the pedestrian push button. Next slide, slide 46. And now we'll talk about push button orientation. So the face of this push button must be parallel to its associated crosswalk, and the push button must have a tactile arrow with high visual contrast that is aligned parallel to the direction of travel on its associated crosswalk. Next slide, slide 47. On to the push button locations. So the push button must be located no more than 5 feet from the side of the curb ramp run or from the edge of the farthest associated crosswalk line from the center of the intersection, and it must be located between 1.5 feet and 10 feet from the edge of the curb or pavement. Now, where there are 2 push buttons provided on the same corner, they must be 10 feet apart minimum, unless in cases of alterations where this is not technically feasible, then they can be less than 10 feet apart. And that'll come up again here shortly. Next slide, slide 48. So the push buttons must have a locator tone so that somebody who can't see can actually find it. So the tone must have a duration of 0.15 seconds or less, and it must repeat at 1 second intervals. And when another audible indication from the same device is active, the locator tone must be silenced. And there is an exception, another exception for when it can be silenced. So the locator tone may be silenced if a passive detection system activates it when a pedestrian is within a 12-foot radius of the push button. Next slide, slide 49. So as I mentioned, pedestrian signal heads must have accessible walk indications. And this again is just for pedestrian signal heads, not for pedestrian activated warning devices, since those don't actually have a walk indication. So for these, the push button or the passive detection must activate the accessible walk indication during the walk interval only. Now, where the pedestrian signal rests in walk, the accessible walk indication may be limited to the first 7 seconds of the walk interval. Now, if the pedestrian signal rests in walk for a long time and there is sufficient time remaining to provide an accessible walk interval before the beginning of the pedestrian change interval or before the upraised hand comes up, then the accessible walk indication may be recalled with a button press. So say I get to one of these and it's got a 50-second walk interval. I get to it after 20 seconds. There's still 30 seconds left. I can push the button and recall the accessible walk indication so that I can know that I still have time to cross instead of having to wait the 30 seconds and then wait the full time for the rest of the cycle. Now, the accessible walk indication has an audible component, which is by default a percussive tone, and there are requirements for this percussive tone in the PROAG. But this is true except where 2 push buttons are less than 10 feet apart on the same corner, in cases where alterations made it technically infeasible to have them 10 feet apart or more. Then that audible walk indication is going to be a speech message. And the walk indication also has a vibrotactile component, which is that the push button must vibrate. Next slide, slide 50. Now, where these speech messages are required, the message for intersections having pedestrian phasing that is concurrent with vehicular phasing is patterned Broadway, walk sign is on to cross Broadway, and messages for intersections having exclusive pedestrian phasing are patterned as walk sign is on for all crossings. Next slide, slide 51. So speech messages when the walk interval is not timing. So where speech information messages are made available at a pre-timed signal or by actuating the accessible pedestrian push button or the passive detection device, then they must only be actuated when the walk interval is not timing. Obviously, you don't want anything else going when the walk interval is timing. Now, the message must begin with the term wait, followed by intersection identification information modeled after wait to cross Broadway at Grand. And if information on intersection signalization or geometry is also given, then it would follow the intersection identification information. Now, if a pilot light is used for a signal, then each actuation of the button must be accompanied by the speech message wait. So if that pilot light is on, then somebody pushes the button, then it's just supposed to say wait. Next slide, slide 52. So there are volume requirements. Now for locator tones and audible walk indications and for the audible status indications or indicators for the pedestrian activated warning devices, these all must be louder than ambient sound up to a maximum volume of 5 dBA louder than ambient sound. And the volume must automatically adjust in response to the ambient traffic sound up to a level that is capped at a maximum of 100 dBA. Now, the locator tones must be audible 6 to 12 feet from the push button or to the building line, whichever is less. And the audible walk indications and the audible status indicators must be audible from the beginning of their associated crosswalks. So you don't have to necessarily stand right by the pole to hear it. You get down to the beginning of the crosswalk and you can still hear that audible indication. And finally, accessibility features must be available at all times. No turning them off at night or turning them off on Sundays. And I have definitely encountered this. Next slide, slide 53. Okay, now we're going to talk about crosswalk treatments for roundabouts and channelized turn lanes. And this may seem a bit random, but it's kind of related because several of these treatments have accessible pedestrian signal requirements that are associated with them. So for each multi-lane segment of a roundabout containing a crosswalk, and for crosswalks at multi-lane channelized turn lanes, these must provide a crosswalk treatment consisting of one or more of the following. So they can either have a traffic control signal with a pedestrian signal head, which would require that accessible pedestrian signal with the accessible walk indication, or they could have a pedestrian hybrid beacon, which would also require the accessible pedestrian signal with the accessible walk indication, or they can have a pedestrian actuated rectangular rapid flashing beacon, which would require, and of course, this is an example of a pedestrian activated warning device, which would require the audible speech message giving telling what the status of that beacon is. Or you could have a raised crosswalk, which of course, or a raised crossing, which of course has no associated requirement for accessible pedestrian signals, unless you combine it with one of those other ones, which you certainly could do. And frankly, I hope that you might. Now, next slide, slide 54. So that is it for the technical requirements for designing the accessible crosswalks. But before we get to questions, I just wanted to address what is next for PROAG, because we get this question all the time. So these guidelines will become enforceable standards under the Americans with Disabilities Act after they are adopted by the Department of Justice and/or the Department of Transportation. But as I think Travis mentioned previously, keep in mind that state and local government entities have obligations under Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act to ensure that their facilities are accessible to and usable by pedestrians with disabilities. And this, of course, does include public rights of way. So just because these guidelines aren't enforceable standards yet, that doesn't get people off the hook for making their public rights of way accessible. Now, these guidelines will become enforceable under the Architectural Barriers Act after they are adopted by the General Services Administration or the Department of Defense or the Department of Housing and Urban Development or the U.S. Postal Service. Any of these could adopt them and make them enforceable for those agencies. Now, to get some idea of these agencies' progress toward adopting these guidelines, you can go to the current unified agenda of regulatory and deregulatory actions. And there is a link on the slide if you go to the Accessibility Online website and download the handouts for this presentation. You can get that link. And basically you go there and you can choose your agency, and then you can see all the actions that the agency is planning to take, mind you, to take in the next quarter or the next year or so. And that's as good as we can get for getting dates of when they're thinking about moving towards adopting these guidelines as standards. And with that, we will move to slide 55, and I think we have some time for questions. And I think I'm turning it over to Josh.
Yes, and pretty much I'm going to say that Juliet has been monitoring the questions as they've been coming in, and we will be trying to get through as many of those as we can in the time permitted. So I'm just going to toss this straight over to Juliet.
All right, thank you, Josh. We did get a lot of questions. Please email us if we do not get to your question. The first one, I do want to clarify on slide 13, there is an error. The image is correct, so that's changes in level. If beveled with a slope no steeper than 1 and 2. So the image is correct, the text on the slide is wrong. Again, that's slide 13, changes in level. Okay, so next question. Are detectable warnings required when sidewalks are flush to the vehicular drive aisles? what driveway width warrants detectable warning surfaces? So yes, detectable warning surfaces at driveways are required if the driveway is stop or yield control. The width of the driveway does not factor into the requirement for detectable warning surfaces.
Can I just make a, oh, I didn't,
Go ahead.
sorry,
No, go
Julia.
ahead.
I just wanted to make a clarification on that just in case, that when we're talking about detectable warnings at driveways, and we're talking about, like, say I'm walking down the sidewalk and I encounter a commercial driveway and it has stop or yield control. So I'm going to be walking across detectable warnings, then across the driveway, and then across more detectable warnings before as I continue down the sidewalk. We're not talking about having detectable warnings at the driveway as it's heading into the street. You know, like if you were coming out of the driveway, walking out of the driveway, you would not encounter detectable warnings as when you would possibly be stepping into the street. These are detectable warnings on either side of the driveway as you walk across it with it perpendicular to you.
Okay, and a follow-up question, is there a code reference number to the requirement for detectable warnings at driveways with stop or yield? Yes, the provision number is R205.7. Sarah, I do have a question for you. Are speech messages required at RRFBs?
They are required. That the message that would be required for an RFB, which would be an example of a pedestrian activated warning devices. So the message that would be required is a message giving the status of the beacon. We do not give requirements for exactly what that message would have to be, but there is a requirement for a speech message there. You would not have any kind of vibrotactile indication there because the message is not going to be a walk indication. It's just going to tell you what that beacon is doing. But there is no walk indication for these types of devices because they do not have an actual walk indication for anybody. Even anybody who sees them is not getting a literal indication saying that it's okay to walk.
Okay. Next question, would striping or marking a crosswalk constitute an alteration that would require reconstructing the pavement for the crosswalk slopes and cross slopes? No, pavement marking alone would not trigger the requirement to rectify the slope or cross slope non-compliances within the crosswalk. Next question, what's the access board's position on brick sidewalks? So the access board does not, the PROAG specifically, and the ADA standards, we don't explicitly state what materials you're allowed to have on the pedestrian access route. What we do require is whatever material you use, it needs to be compliant. So that's firm, stable, slip resistant, the horizontal openings we talked about, the changes in level. Now, there are issues with brick sidewalk for some people who use wheelchairs. The vibration while they're going over those sidewalks can be painful. Another thing you need to think about if you're using, something like brick sidewalk is you've essentially bought yourself a continuing maintenance obligation because you're going to have more separation and, with the brick shifting and whatnot. So you keep that in mind if you choose to have brick sidewalk. Maybe you just use it as an ornamental feature on the border of the sidewalk, but those are some things to think about. But PROAG does not explicitly list acceptable materials to use on the pedestrian access route. Okay, here's another question, and I'll give it to you, Sarah. What are the requirements for when we have two push buttons for two different crosswalks on the same pole?
Oof.
And I'll preface this to say that this is really going to be a longer answer, so maybe just.
And I'm not sure, you probably will give a better answer to this. I mean, having them on the same pole would seem quite difficult because of the locator tone issue. And having the arrows align parallel to the direction of travel. I would say that I would not say that would be easy to be compliant.
Right, so I'll point you to the provision because it's really an extended answer. So the provision is R307 0.4.1. But what we require, so we say where two pedestrian push buttons are provided in the same corner, they really need to be 10 feet or more apart. In alterations, it may be technically infeasible to do that. So what we require is a specific speech information message. So instead of, so you're going to have to give more specific information in terms of the speech message, which crosswalk is on to cross. And then also you need to look at the orientation of the push button. It needs to be aligned to the crosswalk that it serves. So there's multiple things you need to look at if it's technically infeasible to locate your push buttons more than 10 feet apart.
Yeah, and I mean, just having them on the same pole, I think you're going to have a really hard time orienting the arrows in a way that they're going to make any sense, you know, and having that pole the right distance from the crosswalks that it's supposed to be. I think that's going to be difficult. I mean, you can have some distance between poles of less than 10 feet maybe, but having those on the same pole, that just seems like really bad design if you're starting now to make an accessible pedestrian signal.
Okay, there are a couple of questions that came in regarding the 2-inch concrete border at detectable warning surfaces. I just want to clarify, you're not required to have a 2-inch border around the detectable warning surface. We allow up to a 2-inch border around the detectable warning surface. Another question that came in, does the access board have a stance on fully painted crosswalks, such as murals? And the simple answer is no, we do not. Remember, PROAG doesn't even have requirements for pavement marking at crosswalks. Okay, here's another question. In a subdivision where there is no sidewalk in front of homes, is the local agency supposed to enforce the developer to provide sidewalk? That is not something that PROAG addresses. That's really a local jurisdiction decision and whatever their policies are. What PROAG provides is that once you've provided pedestrian circulation paths, they need to be accessible. So we don't necessarily tell you where you need to build them, but we do say that once you build them, you need to make sure they're accessible to and usable by people with disabilities. Another question, may an existing traffic signal, if an existing traffic signal is found to be unwarranted according to the MUTCD, may it be removed and possibly replaced with an RRFB? That's again another question that is not addressed by PROAG. Again, PROAG just requires whatever pedestrian signal you have at an intersection, it needs to be accessible. Another question, can a manhole be within the crosswalk or curb ramp, assuming that the manhole cover meets the change in level requirements, elongated opening, etc.? Sarah, you want to take that?
It can, at least in the crosswalk. In the curb ramp, but I guess you can have what would happen with the detectable warnings is what I would wonder, but for the crosswalk, it could for sure.
Yeah, and that's definitely a challenge in alterations where you already have the utilities in place, right? In new construction, you really want to avoid that. It's not prohibited, but keep in mind when you place, when you have utility lids in the pedestrian access route, that lid needs to comply with the horizontal openings. You might have some maintenance issues, around the perimeter of the lid over time. So those are just some things to keep in mind. So not strictly prohibited, but if you can avoid it, especially in new construction, you want to do that. Okay, next question. Where can I locate the current version of PROAG prior to adoption by DOJ or DOT? Is it only currently published in the Federal Register? So I assume you're talking about Final PROAG, which we just discussed in this webinar. We have that on our website. And on our website, we have a link to the publication in the Federal Register. There have been a lot of requests for diagrams like we had in the proposed rule. We are in the process of working on those diagrams. Keep in mind the rule text has changed in some places, so we want to make sure the diagrams are consistent with the language. And so we are working on those, and we do plan to put them and embed them within the text like we had with the proposed rule. I don't have a specific timeline for you, but one thing I encourage you to do if you want to stay abreast of what we're doing, this is one of those things that would put out in one of our publicity blurbs or social media or newsletter indicating that, hey, we have now published a version with the drawings embedded within the rule text. So we've definitely heard that concern, and it's something that we are working on.
And the address for the PROAG is actually pretty easy. It's www.access-board.gov/PROAG, PROWAG/. So it's on our website at that address.
Okay, another question. Are truncated domes required for shared use path crosswalks? Sarah, you want to take that?
Yes, they are.
They are required. Yeah, remember, and this was in the first half of the presentation, we talked about curb ramps. So if you have a curb ramp or blended transition at a shared use path, you need the detectable warning surface there. So it doesn't matter whether it's just a sidewalk in an urban area, whether it's a shared use path, where you have that curb ramp or blended transition, you do need to have those detectable warning surfaces. Okay. I think I answered that already. Would striping or marking a crosswalk? Yes, I answered that already. Okay, another question. On an alteration project requiring work on only one corner, if a pedestrian push button on an existing pole is replaced with a compliant push button, do the pedestrian don't walk signal heads also need to be replaced? The push button replacement alone does not trigger all the other elements that are connected to the pedestrian signal. So you can replace that push button or make it compliant without triggering the pedestrian signal work. Okay. What is the minimum length of the pedestrian refuge island in the direction of travel? And there were multiple questions related to this. What is the minimum distance between the two detectable warnings on either side of the island? If a pedestrian refuge island is less than 6 feet, can the entire length have a detectable warning surface? So let me start with the definition.
Can I?
Yep, go ahead.
I mean, we had that. I think Travis went over that definition a little while ago and basically said that the pedestrian refuge island had to be 72 inches minimum in the direction of travel. And the reason for this is so that you can actually achieve this separation of the detectable warnings. So like say I'm crossing a street and I get to a pedestrian refuge island and I'm going to hit some detectable warnings and know that I'm somewhere where I can take refuge. At that point, I may not necessarily know whether it's a pedestrian refuge island or the far side of the street. So I'm going to walk up these detectable warnings and think that I'm somewhere safe. And then lo and behold, I'm going to walk a couple of feet and I'm going to find some more detectable warnings. And that's going to be my clue to know that, in fact, I'm going to go back into the street and cross some more before I finally get to the other side. That's the point of having the pedestrian refuge island at a 72-inch minimum. So you can have those detectable warnings and have the separation so that I can know that when I get across, I'm done, but then I'm not completely done. Like I have actually seen this where you may have like a pedestrian refuge strip of some sort in the middle of the street, and it's not 72 inches minimum. And they have detectable warnings there, and it's like one set. So how am I to know if I'm not familiar with the street that when I hit those detectable warnings and then pass them, that I'm not up on the sidewalk and that I'm actually going into another part of the street? This is the reason. So if your pedestrian refuge, whatever it is less than 72 inches minimum, don't put detectable warnings there. But if you really intend for people to take refuge there and you're going to calculate a pedestrian clearance time to a pedestrian refuge island, it needs to be 72 inches minimum in the direction of travel.
Thanks, Sarah. I have another one for you. Can you please clarify what an extended push button means and what situations it would be used?
Okay, so you can press the button when you go to one of these accessible pedestrian signals. You can just push the button really quickly, and it's just going to activate any walk timing or status indication. But if you hold that button for longer, or a second or longer, then it's possible, it's not required, but it's possible that they have provided additional features for the pedestrian, the accessible signal activates. So if you just punch the button really quickly, you're activating the walk indication, or it's gonna tell you when the walk indication is on, or it's gonna give you the status indication as it goes. But if you hold that button for a little bit longer, that way you can find out if there are any accessible feature, any additional features, excuse me, that have been provided. Now, it's a little difficult because sometimes even if we hold that button, we may not necessarily know what those features are, because I've yet to encounter one that actually tells me that I get additional crossing time, and the requirement is that there's a sign that says that you get it, but there's nothing that requires that they audibly tell me that I'm going to get it. But that's the idea. Press the button quickly, you get the indication. Press it for a long time, you can see if there are any other features. And some of them that I've actually encountered have been that if you press it quickly, it'll say like wait. And then when it's time to cross, it'll say walk sign is on to cross, 6th at Pennsylvania. But if I hold it, it'll say wait to cross 6th Street. It'll tell me that. And I don't know that that's necessarily an additional feature, but that is something that happens sometimes if you do an extended press on those.
Okay. Next question. Are these requirements for pedestrian crosswalks applicable to parking areas at shopping centers? I'm assuming you're asking about crosswalks within the shopping center itself, so within the site. PROAG applies to the public right-of-way. If you're doing anything on a site, you should be looking at the ADA accessibility guidelines, so ADAG, which is for sites and buildings, not PROAG. And the next question, is there any guidance or rules around fall protection or edge protection for back of sidewalks or back of curb ramps when the walkway is elevated by a wall or has a steep slope? No, not in PROAG. You definitely can do some sort of edge protection for safety, but PROAG doesn't have that requirement. The only thing you want to keep in mind is if you do add edge protection to your sidewalk, for example, make sure you're still maintaining the minimum required width. But PROAG does not get into requirements for edge protection where there's a steep drop off. Okay, another question. If it's a completely new town, are all sidewalks and curb ramps required to be accessible throughout the town versus one accessible route to the building entrance concept? Okay, so the one accessible route to the building entrance concept is an ADAG, buildings and sites concept. That doesn't translate in the public right-of-way. So yes, if it's a completely new town, all sidewalks and curb ramps are required to be accessible throughout the town. And this question has also come through to us in a different way, where the question is asked, can I have accessible sidewalk on one side of the street and that be sufficient and the other side does not have to be? No. PROAG requires anywhere you provide a pedestrian circulation path, you must provide a pedestrian access route. Okay, next question. What is the maximum? It says maximum, but I think they're asking about the maximum. What is the maximum length on the curb ramp for the 15-foot rule? So the 15-foot rule essentially says that if you have a curb ramp and it's adjoining, let's say, a steep road, and so you're trying to catch grade, you're trying to, the maximum curb ramp slope is 8.3%. But when you try to do your curb ramp, it's going to have to go, I don't know, 30 feet, 50 feet to actually maintain an 8.33% grade. What the 15 rule says is extend that curb ramp at least 15 feet at whatever grade you can achieve over that 15 feet. So again, if you can't meet the 8.33% grade, run the curb ramp out 15 feet at whatever grade you can achieve over that distance. Okay, next question. Can you elaborate on examples of shared use path widths for the pedestrian path? A 10-foot shared use ramp needs a 10-foot curb ramp width. I guess that's the question. So I guess I'll address two things. First, PROAG does not specify how wide your shared use path should be. You decide how wide it's going to be. What PROAG specifies is the entire width of that shared use path needs to be accessible. It needs to meet the accessible design requirements. And in terms of the curb ramp, when you get to the crosswalk, the curb ramp that adjoins a shared use path to a crosswalk needs to be as wide as that shared use path. And the idea here is when you have a shared use path, you have multiple users going in both directions. And so you don't want to funnel them down to a 4-foot wide curb ramp. So again, that's why we require that at shared use path, that curb ramp needs to be as wide as the shared use path. And Josh, let me know if I'm getting to the time limit.
Yep, I'm keeping an eye on it. You've got just a few more minutes before I'm going to take over.
Okay. Next question. At existing intersections, not mid-block or roundabout, where the cross slope of the pedestrian access route within a crosswalk cannot feasibly comply with the required cross slopes due to existing conditions, can we still provide accessible crosswalks at those areas? So the expectation is in new construction, you should be able to meet a lot of the requirements in PROAG. In alterations, you're going to have a lot of existing constraints, a lot of existing physical constraints. So in that case, what is expected is that you meet the requirements to the maximum extent feasible. Yes, maybe your cross slope may be a little off or what have you, some requirement you may not be able to meet. The expectation is you meet the requirements to the maximum extent feasible. Okay.
Let's do one more.
Okay. Next question. In phased right-of-way pedestrian path development, where curb ramps are constructed for intersection improvements, but continuing sidewalks are not constructed simultaneously, are there requirements not to create dead ends by including wheelchair turning spaces? No, there aren't any requirements. So your sidewalk along a block, for example, maybe it's going to be constructed in pieces as a developer comes on. There is no requirement that where that sidewalk terminates, short of the block, that you provide a turning area or a turning space of any sort. Okay, that's it, Josh.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Great. Thank you guys very much. That was a lot of questions. Obviously, there are more. The Q&A box says there's over 99 that are in there. So obviously, there are more questions than we have time to answer and just sitting around doing this for a day. So if you do have any other questions, please email us. And that's where I'm going to continue on next is our available resources. So next slide, 56. So the first resource that I want to tell you guys about is our technical guides on the standards. So while today that has been PROAG and so these guides, we don't have a PROAG guide yet. It is something that is under development, but I cannot give you a release date. But it is something that we will develop another guide for. But for now, we do have guides that are going to get you through fully through 1 through 6, and then the signs portion of chapter 7. We are getting closer on our detectable warnings guide, but it's still not exactly close. So these are going to be really good print guides that help you out, particularly if you're looking at this stuff. You're going to find the accessible route ones. You're going to find the operable part ones very useful. And they really do a good job of combining images, text, examples, recommendations, so that you have a better understanding of what the requirements in the ADA and ABA are, and not trying to parse through code to understand how all the different components connect together. The other thing that we have on our website are animations that we've done. We've done a series of 8 different animations, and these show people with disabilities maneuvering through different spaces and how they interact with their environment. And this has been a really useful tool to help people internalize and understand why the standards are as they are. There's no unique information in them, but it does cover a lot of information that is also found in these guides. But we've found that people really have a better understanding of the why you can't just take out a couple inches here or there, why that matters. And seeing somebody actually using those spaces is a really good way of doing that. So that is our technical guides that we have at the moment. Next slide, 57. So if you do not find the answer in the guides or elsewhere online, please reach out to us. We are here to answer questions. That is part of our task as the U.S. Access Board, is to answer technical assistance. And so you can call us. Our phone number is 202-272-0080, extension 3. And we're good about answering the phones, but there's only one person monitoring the phones at a time. So if you get sent to voicemail, leave a voicemail. We will return your message. So don't worry about that. Also, you can email us. Our email address is TA for technical assistance, TA@access-board.gov. So that's a really good way of getting more in-depth questions where you have images that really help explain the problem or what you think might be the problem. Sometimes a phone call is great because you can kind of go back and forth and talk nuance, but then sometimes you really have a situation in which an email is going to be helpful. So I just want to let you guys know that you are always free to reach out to us for these answers. Okay, next slide. 58. So just a little note, some housekeeping. This is part of the webinar series that you have just attended, part of our Accessibility Online web series, which occurs on the first Thursday of each month from 2:30 p.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern Time. There are continuing education credits available if you register. And then we have archived live and self-paced webinars. So that there are some webinars that we have archived that you can actually still get your continuing education credits from. However, we have all of them archived if you just want the information. So those are going to be really helpful for you guys if you want to go back and watch any of our previous webinars that we've done. We also do another one that is on section 508, that is technology communication, and that is a best practices when it comes to the private sector, but is a requirement when it comes to federal agencies. And that one is the 4th Tuesday from 1 to 2:30 p.m. of every other month. And they also are archived, but they are not going to get you the continuing education credits. Speaking of continuing education credits, I'm going to leave this slide up for a little bit, just so you guys can write down the information that you might need to on the continuing education credits for this course. The course title was Designing Accessible Crosswalks. The course number is GL20240201, and today is February 1st, 2024. And then finally, as we are approaching 4 o'clock exactly, we are thanking you for your participation in today's webinar. Next month, we will be going over employee work areas and break rooms. And that one will be Deborah Martins and myself. And that will be March 7th of 2024. Thank you all very much and have a great day.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Sarah, Juliet, Travis, all of our speakers for today's session. Thank you to our sign language interpreters and our real-time captioner. This concludes today's session. At this time, you can close out by just closing your browser and or just using the leave option. You will receive an email following today's session that will discuss your certificates of attendance as well as an evaluation, which we encourage you to complete as it helps us to improve sessions going forward. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Great Lakes. Thank you, interpreters. Thank you, captioner. Thank you, my team. Thanks, everyone.